And welcome to another video to teach you about the wonderful world of Latin. Today's video is going to teach you about ablative absolutes and what on earth those are. So we've been talking about participles and how they can be used. We know that Latin participles are used more often than English participles. We know these verbal adjectives do a lot more work in the sentence in terms of communicating what's going on in Latin than they do in English. We also know that Latin has certain constructions, certain things that uses participles that English doesn't have. And one of those is the ablative absolute. So what is it and what participles get used? Well, the ablative absolute tends to use the present active participle, the perfect passive participle, and sometimes the future active participle to create the ablative absolute. So, what are those? Well, let's take it by each word. The first word, ablative. It's a new use of the ablative case. And there will be two words in the ablative case within your ablative absolute, well, two or more. And one will be a noun, and one will be a participle. And that participle will modify the noun, and it will be either the present active participle or the perfect passive participle. And again, sometimes it might be the future active participle, but the present active and perfect passive are your very most common participles for the ablative absolute. So you recognize it because it has an ablative noun and an ablative participle that modify each other. So then what about that absolute part? Well, we're using a meaning of absolute that's coming from the Latin verb absolvo, absolvere, absolvi, absolutum, to loosen away or to detach. And this means that the ablative absolute is grammatically loosened and detached from the rest of the sentence. It's not something that's like the ablative of means or ablative of agent or ablative of manner that's necessary to translate the meaning of your sentence. It doesn't relate to your main verb in terms of grammar. It does in terms of meaning, because the ablative absolute communicates more information about the rest of the sentence, like when something happened or why the main clause happened, or although something happened, then your main clause happened, your independent clause happened. So it's just giving us a lot more information about your independent clause that it's detached from. So let's look at this with some examples so it sounds less confusing. So remember, you'll need to remember the forms of your present active participle. These are the ones with ens, entis, and the perfect passive participle. Again, these are basically just your fourth principal part, and sometimes your future active participle that has that fourth principal part with UR inserted in there. So let's look at a whole sentence. Equo, viso, sacerdos, Troianos, timet. We know there's an ablative absolute because this is a video about ablative absolutes, but how do we know for sure? How do we actually tell from our sentence? Well, first, we've been talking about participles, so let's find our participle. Hey, viso, that's a perfect passive participle that's ablative and masculine singular. And we know that it modifies equo, a noun that's also in the ablative case. So we have the two things we need for an ablative absolute, an ablative participle and a noun modified by that participle. And the third thing that needs to happen to have an ablative absolute is that these cannot grammatically relate to the rest of the sentence. So let's look at the rest of the sentence. Sacerdos, Troianos, timet. We know that sacerdos and Troianos are both nominative masculine singular, and we know timet is a third person singular present active indicative verb. So we know that sacerdos Troianos is our subject. We know that timets are verb and they can stand on their own. They don't need equo wiso to complete the meaning of their sentence. So equo wiso's kind of grammatically detached, loosened away from the rest of the sentence. It's absolute. Hey, it's an ablative absolute. It has all three things we need. And there's also that comma after it that sort of separates it off, breaks it off from the rest of our sentence. Sometimes the comma will be there and will be very helpful. Sometimes it won't. It depends on how nice the author or editor of your text is for you. So, how do we translate this? Well, we know that Sacerdos Trianos Timet is grammatically off on its own. It's detached from equo wiso, so let's just translate it as the Trojan priest is afraid. Now we just have to worry about translating our ablative absolute equo wiso. And you can most literally translate it as with the noun participle. That pattern will work and will give you all of your credit. And it's your with, just like a lot of ablative uses of cases. So in our sentence, with the equo, with the horse, wiso, having been seen, the Trojan priest is afraid. But I realize that doesn't sound totally comfortable for a lot of people, that it doesn't always communicate what that means. So remember, ablative absolutes provide more context about when something happened, why here, like the priest is afraid, or although something happened, the priest is afraid. So we can more loosely translate it as when or since or although, and then the priest is afraid. So we could say when the horse has been seen, the Trojan priest is afraid, or since the horse has been seen, the Trojan priest is afraid, or although the horse has been seen, the Trojan priest is afraid. If you remember the context of this, when there's a horse and a Trojan priest, we're during the Trojan War, where the Greeks leave a giant wooden horse outside the city of Troy, and the Trojan priest Laocoon is afraid of this horse because he doesn't trust the Greeks bearing gifts, and he throws a spear at it to try and prove that it's not that good and to attack it. Ultimately, the rest of Troy doesn't believe him, unfortunately, but for our sentence here, equo wiso Sacerdos Trianos Timet, it doesn't really make sense to say, although the horse has been seen. So with the horse having been seen, the Trojan priest is afraid. That translation works. Or when the horse has been seen, the Trojan priest is afraid. Or since the horse has been seen, the Trojan priest is afraid. Any of those three translations would make sense of all of our context and would work. So once you have all of your notes about this sentence written down, let's continue on to another sentence where you'll get to practice with an ablative absolute. Okay, you get to practice translating the sentence equo in urbem veniente milites Graeci gaudent. So pause the video, translate it, and then we'll check it together. Okay, so you see your participle veniente that's ablative. It's at the beginning of the sentence, which is a good clue. It's an ablative absolute. It's modifying equo, and so we have a noun that's also in the ablative. Another good clue that it's an ablative absolute, but we need to make sure it's not grammatically related to the rest of the sentence with like a preposition or ablative of manner, something like that. So we know milites Graeci are nominative plural masculine. Gaudent is third person plural, present active indicative. So we know those are our subject and our verb. We see that comma is separating equo and urbem veniente off from our independent clause, milites Graeci gaudent. So we have our nice ablative absolute that we can translate using with noun participle. So with the horse coming into the city, because in urbem is part of that participial phrase that is our ablative absolute. So with the horse coming into the city, the Greek soldiers rejoice. If we're not totally comfortable with what that means, based on the context of our Trojan horse and why Greek soldiers would be happy about a horse coming into the city, we could also translate the sentence as when the horse comes into the city, the Greek soldiers rejoice, or since the horse comes into the city, the Greek soldiers rejoice. Any of those translations could work. Once you've corrected your sentence, made sure it's doing fine, you can continue the video. But don't feel bad if this is challenging for you. Ablative absolutes are not very comfortable for English speakers because we don't use them that much in English. The more you translate them in Latin, the more they will be familiar to you. So we just have to practice with them. They will find a way to be more comfortable for you. You just got to stick with it. So to give you more practice with it, it's time for you to check your understanding. So answer these questions after you've paused the video and then call me over to check your work, and then you'll be on your way to learning more about ablative absolutes. Thank you for watching the video and have a nice day.